What is happening, guys? Welcome back to Redbeard's Garage. On today's episode, we're going to be building the Harbor Freight 224cc Max Performance into a true max performing engine. So let's get right into it.
I'm going to start off by taking off the airbox, carb, muffler, throttle bracket, gas tank, and governor arm. Next, remove the fan shroud, coil, and flywheel nut. Reinstall the flywheel nut and place a pry bar behind the flywheel and pry outward while hitting the nut with a hammer to remove the flywheel. Use wire cutters to remove the timing key. Remove the heat shroud, valve cover, and head. Since we're using an aftermarket head, I didn't bother removing any of the valve train from the head. Remove the crankcase cover, cam, lifters, and oil sensor. We can now remove the rod cap and slide out the piston and rod. Slide out the crankshaft and remove the remaining governor parts. We are getting our block Cerakoted, so we'll need to remove all the seals and bearings. We had our block Cerakoted with a heat dissipating coating. I tapped the two governor holes with a 1/4 inch tap and installed these stainless bolts to block them off. I also tapped the oil sensor hole and installed a 7/16 bolt. I drilled the center hole between the lifters to 5/16 to help the oil flow from the head down back into the block. We're using Go Power Sports Stage 4 head with stainless 28.5mm intake and 25mm exhaust valves, 40-pound dual valve springs, billet retainers, and it's fully ported and polished, and it's been milled 65 thousandths. I'm using a 24mm flat slide makuni with an air filter adapter to run the K&N style filters. I'm using a flat top piston to up our compression even more. For the cam, I went with the Fire 265 cam from Go Power Sports. We'll be using Mr. Valve Cover's new billet valve cover for the non-Hemi engines. For valve train, I'm going to go with 1.2 gauge roller rockers and cut to length chromoly push rods. This billet crankcase cover will give us even more rigidity to our already strong block. A short fin billet flywheel will give our engine less drag and more safety while revving high. Billet rod for longevity and strength. To hold all this power, I'll be going with the Go Power Sports Juggernaut pulley. To start off with this build, we need to check our oil clearance on our new billet rod. Place the rod in a pair of soft jaws or gloves in a vise and remove the rod cap. Insert the rod bearing in the cap by lining up the notch. Place the crank onto the rod. We will be using red plastic gauge to check our oil clearance. Cut a small piece of plastic gauge and place it on the crank journal. Without any lube, install the rod cap and torque to spec. Tighten each bolt to 60 inch-pounds and then alternate from bolt to bolt, adding 20 inch-pounds until you reach the desired 170 inch-pounds. Now we can remove our rod cap and check our plastic gauge with the chart on the packaging. We are shooting for 3 thousandths of an inch, but should be no less than 2 thousandths and no greater than 4 thousandths. We are exactly at 3 thousandths, so now we can scrape off the plastic gauge and proceed to installing the rod. I like to remove the governor gear from the crank for less drag. When I installed the crankshaft, I noticed I was hitting the bolt installed in the block to block the oil sensor hole, so it had to be trimmed. I had the piston Cerakoted to keep heat in the combustion chamber and keep our cylinder head cooler. Install the piston ring starting with the expander. Next, install the top and bottom oil scraper. Now we can install the second compression ring with any numbers or letters facing up, followed by the top compression ring. Make sure to orientate the long ear of the rod and the arrow on the piston facing down. Install one of the wrist pin clips into the piston. Oil the rod and the piston and install our wrist pin, followed by the final wrist pin clip. Oil the cylinder and the ring compressor. Orientate the ring openings 120 degrees apart and place the piston into the compressor and tighten. Slide the piston into the block and tap the compressor to seat it against the block. With the handle of a hammer, tap the piston into the block while making sure the compressor stays seated against the block. Oil the crank journal and install the rod cap and repeat the torquing process used before. We are getting contact with our oil dipper on our rod, so we had to remove it and do some clearancing. Oil the cam journal and install the lifters and cam. Make sure to align the dots on the cam and the crank for correct timing. So we got our side cover that we test for clearances on there. So this is a Hemi 212 side cover. That's what's going to match this 224 profile. And I've just taken an old one and cut it apart. Very hard to see down in here, but our piston rod is connecting with the center of our cam, and that is happening right in between the lobes. So what we're gonna have to do is pull our cam out and do a little grinding on our cam in between the lobes on that one ear. So we also have our rod bolt hitting the top of the block. We have our block laying face down, leaned over. So we're gonna have to pull the rod and everything and do a little bit of clearancing there and as well on the cam, and then we should be good to proceed with this build. I had to grind down the ears of the crankshaft and the center shaft on our new cam to make everything clear. Install the included O-ring on the billet side cover and trim to length, and install the oil seal. Install the forward dowels into the side cover. You will need to drill out the top and bottom dowel holes on the block to 5/16. Start with one thick and one thin shim onto the crankshaft before installing the side cover. Install the bolts and torque to spec. We are looking for 15 thousandths to 10 thousandths crankshaft end plate. If we have no end plate, we need to remove the O-ring and use the paper gasket. If we have too much end plate, then we can add more shims until the desired amount is reached. This engine in particular used 2 thin and 1 thick shims. The stage 4 head normally comes ready to go, but I have mine Cerakoted for maximum performance, so we need to lap our valves using a valve grinding compound. Make sure to thoroughly clean the head and the valves after lapping. We can now install our head dowels, gasket, and our head. We have a separate video on how to cut chromoly push rods coming soon. Install the push rods, lash caps, and rockers into our head. I set my valve lash to 3/1000 on the intake and the exhaust. Oil the valve train and install the billet valve cover. Since our head has been milled, we need to use the included spark plug spacer. Use valve grinding compound to lap the new flywheel. Make sure to clean all the compound from the flywheel and the crank before installing our key. Slide the flywheel onto the crank, then the starter cup, and torque to 70 foot-pounds. I used a homemade crankshaft stop from an old CVT pulley to hold the crankshaft while torquing the flywheel. I have a video on how to make these MSD coils linked below. Gap the coil on the flywheel using a 40/1000 feeler gauge, and you will place the feeler gauge in between the coil and the flywheel magnet and tighten the coil. Rotate the flywheel to expel the feeler gauge. We can now install our heat shield, fan shroud, and carb.
Guys, thank you so much for watching today's video. Hope you enjoyed this build out on this 224cc max performance engine. This thing should make around 20 horsepower, maybe a little above. And this is an absolute screamer on a mini bike or a yard cart. And it'll blow your mind at what power gains you'll get doing all this stuff at once. We do have a video series coming out where we do the road to horsepower. We're going to do each individual part and show you the gains in the real world that you're going to get from each individual part. So stay tuned for that. Make sure to check out all the links in the video's description for these parts. They do help us to continue to do these videos. We thank you guys for watching. We love you and God bless.